Imagine being forced to sleep around with different people every day and you have no right to refuse your lovely little daughter losing her virginity to please your master. Well, this will come as a sad story to you. In this episode, we discuss what prostitution was like for Roman slaves. Prostitution in ancient Rome was legal and licensed. In ancient Rome, even Roman men of the highest social status were free to engage prostitutes of either sex without incurring moral disapproval, as long as they demonstrated self-control and moderation in the frequency and enjoyment of sex. Brothels were considered a popular place of entertainment for Roman men, and it was undoubtedly a part of the culture of ancient Rome. At the same time, the prostitutes themselves were considered shameful. Most were either slaves or former slaves. Some large brothels in the 4th century, when Rome was becoming officially Christianized, seem to have been counted as tourist attractions and were possibly state-owned. There were two types of sexual slavery: patronage and prostitution. Prostitutes had to pay a tax, where patronages did not, though it was deemed more acceptable to be the latter. Most prostitutes were slaves or freedwomen, and it is difficult to determine the balance of voluntary to forced prostitution. Because slaves were considered property under Roman law, it was legal for an owner to employ them as prostitutes. The 1st century historian Valerius Maximus presents a story of complicated sexual psychology in which a freedman had been forced by his owner to prostitute himself during his time as a slave. The freedman kills his own young daughter when she loses her virginity to her tutor. Sometimes the seller of a female slave attached a any server clause to the ownership papers to prevent her from being prostituted. The any server clause meant that if the new owner or any owner afterwards used the slave as a prostitute, she would be free. A law of Augustus allowed that women guilty of adultery could be sentenced to forced prostitution in brothels. This law was later abolished. Latin literature makes frequent reference to prostitutes. Historians such as Livy and Tacitus mention prostitutes who had acquired some degree of respectability through patriotic, law-abiding, or eugetic behavior. Prostitution was a common job for slaves in ancient Rome. Prostitutes usually lived in nightmarish conditions. They started working before puberty and were subjected to all manner of verbal and physical abuse. Perhaps, most of them hoped that one of the wealthy clients would fall in love with them and free them. There is some evidence that slave prostitutes could benefit from their labor. In general, slaves could earn their own money by hiring out their skills or taking a profit from conducting their owner's business. Some prostitute slaves were owned by a brothel or a procurer. Poor families might sell their surplus daughters into prostitution as a means of earning some money. Alternatively, they might be war captives, or even criminals. Lenocinium, the name given to the act of controlling prostitutes for gain, was not illegal under Roman law, but it was considered an infamous profession. Pimps or procurers were barred from enjoying certain legal and political rights, holding public office, or marrying a member of the senatorial class. The same prohibitions also applied to actors, gladiators, free prostitutes themselves, and the bankrupt. Slaves could be forced into prostitution at their master's whim. They had no right to refuse. It should be noted, though, that Roman slave owners would often allow their slaves a certain amount of free time each week in which they might work for other people for a fee, and the slave could keep that money as his or her own. Ultimately, after many years, the slaves might thus earn enough money to buy their own freedom. There is no reason to suppose that some slave prostitutes might not also do this, working voluntarily in their own time to earn money. In terms of the demand for prostitution given the existence of slavery, it is true that a slave owner could force his own slaves to have sex with him. Raping another person's slave was considered a crime against the slave owner rather than the slave. However, not all Romans owned slaves. The average cost of an adult slave was more than double the annual income of a Roman legionary, and even if they did, supply and demand meant that young and handsome slave boys and girls sold for 60 times or more the price of a normal laborer. Prostitutes, registered or not, were still treated as slaves, and once someone had been associated with employment in the sex trade, their fate was sealed. Within the world's oldest profession, life would forever be a struggle for survival rather than an adventure filled with the thrills of carnal desire. The living conditions alone made the ancient life of prostitution disease-ridden, painful, and extremely uncomfortable. Even with such inhumane conditions, there were still cultural customs within the sex trade of Rome. In the brothels throughout the Roman Empire, it was very common for the rooms to be small, windowless, and penetrated with the stench of purchased intimacy. The only light would come from phallic-shaped candles used to indicate when a prostitute was ready for her next client. More often than not, water boys would stand outside the brothel rooms readying their bowl for the finished clients to clean themselves after payment was given. In the ancient world, brothels were known to have their own water mains, allowing prostitutes to clean themselves in between clients. However, their water rations would only allow for cleaning their essentials rather than their entire bodies. The prostitutes, such as the cemetery bustoury, were given no such luxuries. They were expected to guarantee satisfaction for their clients from dusk until dawn, and would then await their turn at the public bathhouses only if they had made enough money to enter. Though bathing was a luxury, the appearance of cleanliness was essential for maintaining clients in ancient Rome by way of scent, style of dress, and grooming. For those who didn't have access to bathhouses or brothel water supplies, another option developed. While it didn't help much when it came to hygiene, at least it created the delusion of cleanliness. The bustoury used perfume to mask the scent of death and stench of previous encounters. Part and parcel of a lifestyle filled with allure and desire was the concern of conception at any moment. Although the ancient world had developed certain contraceptives, becoming pregnant was very common amongst prostitutes, as was the practice of infanticide. In the current era, infanticide is rightly perceived as a negative and very unfortunate. However, in ancient Rome, infanticide was completely up to the father. If the family's patriarch dubbed the child unnecessary, he was in his legal right to dispose of the child however he wanted. Often the reasons behind an act of infanticide were due to deformity, or, regrettably, if the child was a girl. Roman prostitutes who were burdened with an unwanted pregnancy often killed their babies shortly after birth. It was common throughout Rome for prostitutes to dress differently from citizens. At a site near Pompeii, a gold bracelet was found on the body of a 30-year-old woman inscribed with, "The master to his very own slave girl." This bracelet is a reminder that not every slave was treated the same. Several paintings in Pompeii show prostitutes completely naked, or sometimes with gold body chains and other expensive jewelry. From the late Republican or early Imperial era onwards, meretrices may have worn the toga when in public, through compulsion or choice. The possible reasons for this remain a subject of modern scholarly speculation. Togas were otherwise the formal attire of citizen men, while respectable adult freeborn women and matrons wore the stola. This crossing of gender boundaries has been interpreted variously. At the very least, the wearing of a toga would have served to set the meretrix apart from respectable women, and suggest her sexual availability. Bright colors and jeweled anklets also marked them out from respectable women. In Pompeii, there have been artifacts found that may suggest some sexually enslaved people may have worn jewelry gifted to them by their masters. Expensive courtesans wore gaudy garments of see-through silk. Some passages by Roman authors seem to indicate that prostitutes displayed themselves in the nude. Nudity was associated with slavery, as an indication that the person was literally stripped of privacy and the ownership of one's own body. A passage from Seneca describes the condition of the prostitute as a slave for sale. Naked she stood on the shore, at the pleasure of the purchaser. Every part of her body was examined and felt. The satirist Juvenal describes a prostitute as standing naked at the entrance to her cell. The erotic wall paintings of Pompeii and Herculaneum show women presumed to be prostitutes wearing the Roman equivalent of a bra, even while actively engaged in sex acts. Thanks for watching, and remember to share this video.